Can you talk a little bit about what you noticed on your instructional planning report about your students this last year?
From my report, I noticed that they were doing better than I thought. Pandemic. I was thinking post-pandemic, they were just at a loss. But I got rid of pencil and paper, and I noticed, got rid of computers and went back to pencil and paper. And so I noticed a lot of growth, areas to improve, and I have to take responsibilities for those who did not do well, as well as the things that went well.
And what about you, Celine, when you're thinking about looking at your instructional planning report and, as Jackie was saying, her students did better than she expected, what were you thinking as you were looking at your results?
For me, overall, I was very, very proud. During the course of the year, especially, I would say throughout most of the fall, I was a little saddened, I guess it's kind of called the post-COVID hangover, not really knowing, where each of the students were, not just sort of academically, but emotionally, and just sort of coming in and, they're still having a lot of outside of the room experiences that are affecting inside the classroom. And so you think even more than that, we're approaching all of the whole student more than we ever have. And so looking at the students and through the fall, I think I definitely have taken a much slower pace in my planning, and I have definitely left more room during my units to circle back for opportunities for reteaching or opportunities for conversations about their writing than I ever have. There's always a space for that, but there was always this lingering pressure that there's a need to move forward and to push forward. And in my school, I'm in Texas, and my school is very large. We just have 11th and 12th grade, but last year we had about 2,600 enrollment. And probably a little over 300 students in the AP program. So I work with a team of teachers that I lead for the AP Literature program. And so of that vast number of students, I'm really looking at the program as a whole. And I'm really trying to make sure we offer opportunities for all of them to build those skills. And so we constantly had to meet, and we do meet every week as a PLC, but we also had to reevaluate our pacing and to make sure that the selections in our course, the desire that we had to incorporate, voices and worlds of ideas and perspectives, that we were giving them opportunities to really grow and to expand and to recognize in their own writing and their own experiences with thinking critically, and to sort of have some more of those moments of metacognition that, I don't think that, students are very, well, I know that they're not adept at doing so regularly. That's something we do as English teachers. We think about our writing, we think about our reading, we share those experiences, but the kids don't really necessarily have the vocabulary to do that. So I would say that my fall semester went, in a strange way, the slowest it's ever gone, and I had the biggest concern I ever had about moving forward into the second semester with them and getting closer to the exam. There was sort of a lot of panic, if that's the right word, amongst my group of teachers for our students. Like, did they have the stamina? Did they have the confidence? We were trying to build the capacity the whole year, but in many cases, for different reasons, they had a lot of they voiced a lot of anxiety about being able to do the exam and to sit for it. So I was really excited to see their results, and really excited to get some of their the feedback once they got their scores. I was actually out of the country when the scores came out, and so I felt nervous, but I didn't have the time to kind of delve in there and sort of look what was happening. But with their notes, I was so excited to kind of hear from them and tell them, we felt good about the experience.
And Brandon, I want to add to that,
yes, please.
Just the pandemic, just like Celine said, slower. So what I'm learning is that less is more. I had a lot of anxiety going into the test. I had a lot of anxiety, and I think I've slowed down slower than I've ever slowed before. But I think it's working because I think less is more. So it seems that slowing down and doing less is actually beneficial based on the scores that I saw. So all the teachers out there, less is more for sure.
Well, and I mean, I have never sat through one of Jackie's workshops, nor has she sat through mine. I've never sat through one of Celine's workshops, nor has she sat through mine. Though both of you are on my list of, if I ever get a chance to just go and be in an APSI, to learn from colleagues. But I say that because so many of the APSIs for literature, I feel like I'm having to convince some teachers, not all, but some teachers, you don't have to do 8 novels and 4 plays. Like, slow down. And we are not teaching the junior level English major course that we took, where we read a novel a week or something like that. And I did have a class like that, and it was brutal. But it's more about kids learning how to experience a text, like what Celine said, us helping coach kids on how to think about text the way we do, because they don't think like we do. They don't think like English majors do. And sometimes we have to slow down and say, oh, how do I think about these things? And we take that for granted because we do it kind of innately. That's what made us English people. And so I'm so glad to hear you all talking about that. That is so important. And to hear that you've been successful with that, like that your students have improved with that slowing down and being able to be more thoughtful with it. And often the argument I hear is people say, well, but they have to have read so many texts in order to be successful on question 3. Well, 1, I don't think that's true. 2, question 3 is 1 essay. And it's the one that on average kids around the world do the best on. So I ain't worried about question 3. And I'm really worried about the multiple choice and how well they're showing certain skills on the multiple choice. And I'm really worried about poetry analysis, because that's the one that intimidates them the most. And that's the one that they traditionally do the worst on. So I'm really glad to hear you all sharing these sorts of things. And I see Jerry over here in the chat. You all need to listen to Jerry Brown. Yes, less is more. He says he saw a major growth in writing in the last month before the exam, and it was coming together for them. Yeah. And something that Jerry says there too, teach writing, teach paragraphs. Do not forget the course is called AP English Literature and Composition. And some of you are like, well, of course I'm doing that, but not everybody is. And so don't forget that, teach paragraphs. And I'll get into that a little bit. I'm going to not get ahead of myself here. But so ladies, as I work with teachers around the country and some of the cohorts of teachers that I worked with through the year, we got in touch when score reports came out and we looked at them. I wasn't surprised to see the big ideas that they were struggling with the most, students were struggling with the most, were structure and narrator. When you all think about those, you may have seen something different on your reports. If so, I want to hear about it. And the people who are here want to hear about it. But when you think about structure or teaching narrative, what are some approaches you suggest to people in your APSIs?
So with the narrator, is that what we're talking about? Yeah.
Narrator or structure. Yeah. Or something that's on your report you want to talk about.
That was on my report too. So I was thinking, with the unit 1, it has a video on narrator. I think it's Carlos. They're excellent. So what I did with those is I went through those and created almost like worksheets that went with it. And it says who has the power? Whoever tells the story has the power. And so we started thinking about that from that perspective when it comes to narrator and who's telling the story, who has the power. So when I started my school year this year, I wanted every student to be able to read, opportunity to read every day. We had to get that reading going. So what I did is that I wanted everyone, we did an author study on Jasmine Ward. So she has 5 novels. I created a PowerPoint of her novels with what each novel was about, a video of her talking about the novel and then some type of review. I allowed the students to go through that and to select which novel they wanted to read. From the novel they selected, then they ended up being in groups for their novel. So what we did is we went through it with the AP skills. So at maybe every 2 or 3 classes, so they would read every day for about 15 minutes from Jasmine Ward, one of her novels. They decided how much they needed to read in order to every 3rd class, they would do an activity. So if I knew they had trouble with characterization, we would do some of those videos, those deep dives on characterization. What's the person's motivation? And then we would do that for the novels that they were reading. So everyone is on a different novel, but the same skills. And I found that to be very, it was rewarding for me, for the students, because everyone was reading. It's like that author study. And then some students end up reading 2 or 3 of her novels. Because you finish one, is skill-based. You can go to the next novel and do the next skill with that novel. So for that, I use that to do a deep dive into characterization, into narration, plot, structure. You know, what does the setting have to do with the story? But I really relied on the videos a lot to help with those skills.